33, the $10 Amish air well that pulls 5 gallons of water from thin air, everyday cold air, sits heavy on the porch rail. Your hand brushes the wood, still damp from night. A bucket waits under a crooked wire frame. No rain came, not a drop, yet there's water inside, not a splash, not a trickle. Several inches, clear and still. One number sticks out more than the rest. $10, that's all it cost. I remember my grandfather staring at mornings like this. He never trusted what he couldn't see forming overnight, but he trusted what he could collect. And this setup, it keeps doing the same quiet thing, night after night, without noise, without power. The strange part isn't that water is there, it's that nobody agrees on why it works so well. Some call it old farm sense. Some say it's just dew and timing. But when you wake up to a bucket like that, you start asking different questions about the air itself. If you've ever seen water show up in places it shouldn't, you already understand why this conversation matters. Some of these old setups live longer in memory than in books. If you've got a trick from a barn, a garden, or a quiet piece of land that still works when the power stays off, I'd like to hear it. People compare notes here, nothing fancy. Just real ground stories. Everything feels paused. Even the wind moves carefully. On the porch, that bucket sits exactly where it was left last night. No one touched it, no animal bumped it, no rain crossed the sky. But there's water inside again, still. Heavy enough to notice at a glance. You don't need to guess twice. It wasn't there before sleep. That kind of change doesn't usually happen without a reason. And yet here it is. Like the night left something behind on purpose. The frame above it is simple. Just bent wire and old mesh. Nothing that looks like it should matter. Nothing that looks important. Still, droplets cling to it like they belong there. Not running. Not dripping fast. Just forming slow and steady. Like the air itself got tired and started releasing what it was holding. It feels almost too quiet to question out loud, but your mind does it anyway. Because water doesn't usually appear like this. Not without rain, not without pipes, not without explanation. My grandfather used to say mornings tell the truth if you stand still long enough. He wasn't a man for big theories, just habits. He'd walk out before breakfast, boots on cold ground, checking buckets and boards. Sometimes he'd nod like he already knew what the sky had done. Other times he'd just sit and watch without saying a word. I didn't understand it back then. I thought it was just routine. Now it feels more like he was reading something most people walk past, something quiet, something constant. The odd part is how ordinary everything looks while it's happening. There's no flash, no sound, no sign of effort. Just water collecting where nothing obvious is feeding it. You start looking for hoses, hidden tanks, tricks of angle or placement. Because the mind prefers explanation over mystery, always has. But nothing obvious shows itself here. Nothing mechanical, nothing powered. Only morning air cooling down after a warm night. And a bucket that refuses to stay empty. I kept coming back to it over several days. Not because I believed it at first, but because doubt gets harder to hold when results repeat. Each morning looked similar. Slightly different amounts, slightly different patterns. Some mornings barely anything. Other mornings enough to make you pause longer than expected. That inconsistency matters more than people think. It's what keeps it honest, keeps it from feeling like a trick. And still, it doesn't fully explain itself. One morning, I watched the mesh close enough to see it breathe almost. Not literally, but in the way moisture gathers and releases, tiny beads forming where metal meets cold air. They don't fall all at once. They decide slowly. Then they move, downward, toward the center, toward the bucket waiting below. It looks less like creation and more like collection. Like something already in the air is finally admitting where it belongs. And that idea stays with you longer than expected. There's a name some folks throw around for setups like this. They call it an Amish air well, though no one agrees on it. Some say it's just dew catching with a nicer story wrapped around it. Others insist old homesteads knew more about morning water than modern systems. Admit, truth sits somewhere quieter in between those arguments. Not magic, not myth, just conditions lining up the right way. But even knowing that doesn't take away the feeling when you see it working. You still look twice every time. And that's where the real tension starts forming. Because if this is just condensation, then why does it sometimes feel like more? Why do some nights give almost nothing while others surprise you completely? That inconsistency pulls your attention deeper than any guarantee ever could. It makes you want to understand the conditions, not just the outcome. Temperature, wind, humidity, timing, all of it suddenly matters. And the more you think about it, the more the bucket stops being simple. It becomes a question sitting quietly on the porch waiting for an answer. The first thing you learn when you stop calling it a trick is this: air is never empty. It only looks that way from a distance. Out here, before sunrise, it carries yesterday's heat in slow motion. It holds moisture, the same way a jar holds scent after it's been opened. You don't see it working, but you feel it when metal turns cold overnight. That's when the shift happens. Warm air loses its grip, and what it was holding starts looking for something solid to land on. Most people walk right through that moment without ever noticing. Old farm life was built around that timing more than most people realize. Not inventions, not machines, just attention. Folks would hang cloth lines outside before bed, not for laundry alone, but because certain mornings would leave them heavier than expected. Damp enough to wring out, not from rain, from air itself. Nobody called it science in conversation. They just called it a good morning. And if it didn't happen, they didn't argue with it. They adjusted and waited. That kind of patience is rare now, almost forgotten. There was an old neighbor down the road who never trusted running water, not in a dramatic way, just quiet caution. He kept barrels in places most people would ignore, under eaves, beside sheds, even one tucked behind a fence line. He said water already knows where it wants to go. You just need to give it a place to decide. I remember seeing those barrels half hidden in tall grass, waiting. They never looked important until you saw them full. What people miss is how much water moves through the air daily, not in storms, in silence, in temperature shifts you don't notice. Warm afternoons pull it up, cool nights let it fall back down. That cycle doesn't stop just because we stop paying attention to it. It keeps happening over fields, rooftops, and open ground every night. The only difference is whether something is there to catch it, or whether it disappears back into the soil unseen. That part alone changes how you look at morning light. Now, here's where most modern thinking breaks a little. We tend to believe water has to arrive in obvious ways: pipes, wells, trucks, payments, systems you can name. But nature doesn't follow that structure. It never did. It works in slow exchange, give and take, hour by hour. And when you stand close to something like this frame, you start seeing it, not as invention, but as interruption, a pause point in a cycle, something simply collecting what was already passing through. I won't pretend it always works the same. It doesn't. Some nights feel generous. Others feel like nothing is there at all. Humidity matters more than hope. Wind can ruin everything quietly. That's the honest part most people leave out when they tell these stories. There's no switch you flip, no guarantee you get rewarded. And if you expect certainty, this will disappoint you quickly. But if you understand variability, you start seeing patterns instead of promises. That's where usefulness begins. Still, I've watched enough mornings to notice something consistent underneath it all. When conditions line up just right, the collection becomes noticeable fast, not dramatic, just steady enough to make you rethink what nothing means. A surface you thought was dry suddenly holding weight. A bucket that was empty at dusk now reflecting morning light differently. That shift builds its own kind of trust over time, not belief, observation, repeated enough to stop feeling accidental. And that's where curiosity stops being curiosity and starts becoming attention, because once you've seen it more than once, the question changes. It's no longer, is this real? It becomes, how far can this actually go when everything lines up right? And that question is where the old frame stops being simple again. It pulls you forward into the part most people never bother to test. The part where design matters, angle matters, timing matters even more. And that's exactly where we go next. The frame itself is nothing special when you see it bare. A few boards, some wire mesh stretched tight, that's all. No moving parts. No hidden container, no trick hidden underneath. It leans just slightly toward the center, like it's listening for something. That angle matters more than people expect. Small things decide big outcomes here, because when moisture forms, it doesn't care about intention. It follows gravity, always has, always will. And this setup is really just a quiet way of giving gravity a path. If you built it from scratch, you'd be surprised how little it costs. Scrap wood from a shed corner, nails you already forgot you owned. Mesh from a hardware roll that most people use for fencing. And a bucket, always a bucket, the kind that never really wears out. Altogether, you're looking at something close to $10 in missed scraps. Not because it's cheap in theory, but because it uses what already exists. That's the part that makes it feel older than it is. Nothing new added, just rearranged. The way it works isn't complicated, even if it feels unfamiliar at first. Night air cools down and carries moisture with it. When that air touches the cooler mesh, it releases part of what it holds. Tiny droplets form, not all at once, slowly, almost hesitantly. They gather until weight pulls them down. Then they travel, along wire, along angle, into a single point above the bucket. It's not creation, it's collection. That distinction matters more than anything else in this whole setup. Now, here's the part that keeps people honest about it. It doesn't behave the same every night, not even close. Humidity changes everything. Wind can strip results down to almost nothing. Dry regions will barely see a trace some mornings, but in still, humid air, especially after warm days, it performs differently. That's where people start talking about numbers like 5 gallons. I've seen claims like that passed around, but only under very specific conditions, and even then, it's not something you can count on daily. So here's the honest hedge you won't hear in louder versions of this idea. This isn't a replacement for a well or a tank. It won't carry a household. It won't solve drought on its own. On some nights, you'll question whether it's doing anything at all. That's part of it. And if that truth makes it less exciting, it also makes it more real. Because systems that always promise too much usually don't survive contact with weather. This one survives because it admits its limits up front. Still, I kept thinking about why people build it anyway, even knowing it won't save them in a hard season. There's something about watching water appear where there was nothing before. It changes how you think about dependency, about supply, about waiting. Even a small amount shifts your attention back to the environment around you. You start noticing temperature drops again, wind shifts again, morning patterns again. That awareness alone becomes part of the value. And when enough people build slightly different versions of it, something interesting happens. They start comparing mornings instead of opinions. One porch gets more than another. One angle works better than expected. Not because of belief, but because of observation stacking over time. Quiet knowledge building in small increments. No one owns it, no one controls it. It just spreads through trial and error. And that's where this simple frame stops being just a frame, because once you've seen what it can and can't do, the next question becomes unavoidable. If you can pull this much from air under the right conditions, what else around a homestead is already offering more than we notice? And that question is where everything starts to widen again. That question tends to sit with you longer than expected, not loudly, just quietly in the background of ordinary mornings. Because once you've watched water appear on a frame like this, you stop trusting the idea that everything useful must come through a pipe. You start noticing smaller exchanges again. Dew on grass, moisture on metal, condensation on cold glass in the kitchen. Things you used to ignore become part of a larger pattern. Not dramatic, just consistent. And consistency is where usefulness lives. But this is also where honesty has to stay in the picture. This setup will not carry a household. Not even close. It will not replace a well, a pump, or stored reserves. Some mornings it gives plenty. Other mornings, almost nothing at all. Weather decides more than design ever will. And if someone tries to sell it as certainty, they're already bending the truth. The value isn't in volume. It's in awareness of what's already around you. That shift matters more than the water itself in many cases. I've seen families try versions of this during long, dry stretches, not as a miracle. Just as an extra layer, a row of frames near a garden fence, buckets placed under eaves, nothing complicated. Just quiet additions to what was already there. On certain weeks, it was enough to keep greens alive a little longer. Not forever, not perfectly, but enough to notice a difference in effort. And sometimes that's what matters most in hard seasons. Small relief, not total solution. There's something steadying about systems like this. They don't demand trust in a single point of failure. They spread responsibility across simple, visible parts of the land. If one piece underperforms, nothing collapses. It just adjusts. That idea alone changes how people think about dependence. Not in a loud, rebellious way, in a practical one. Like quietly keeping extra jars in a pantry, just in case. Preparedness without noise. That's the real shift. And when you stand near it in the early morning, watching droplets form and fall into a plain bucket, you realize the lesson was never really about water alone. It was about attention, about noticing what the world already offers before buying more of it, not rejecting modern systems, just not relying on them blindly, layering small, quiet backups into everyday life. That's where this simple frame earns its place, not as a solution, but as a reminder. The next morning, It still looks ordinary. Wood, mesh, a bucket half in shadow. Nothing about it demands belief or attention. But the water is there again in its own modest way. Not enough to impress anyone passing by, but enough to matter to the person who placed it there the night before. And that gap between impressive and useful is where the truth usually sits. Before leaving it, you find yourself checking the angle again. Not because it changed, but because you've changed how you look at it. A small adjustment here, a different placement there. Not chasing perfection anymore, just better conditions. That mindset tends to spread into other parts of life without permission. Water storage, food storage, even how you watch the weather. Everything becomes a little more intentional, a little less automatic. And that shift tends to stay. So if there's anything this simple $10 frame really leaves behind, it's not the water it collects on good nights. It's the question it leaves hanging in the air after you walk away. What else around you is already working quietly, waiting only for someone patient enough to notice it?